Welcome to another episode here at Lighting Mud. We have our second episode in terms of lighting panel discussion talk. And as usual, we have Saurabh here today, and as well as Nora, who I believe didn't have the opportunity to join last time. So you guys get to meet her today. Our topic today is PBR. It's an important topic. It's a topic that people sometimes get wrong. It's a topic that is important for lighting artists and most of us. It's also made our life easier doing PBR, and we will be talking about also how it used to be back in the days when you were doing texturing and Photoshop and kind of adjusting the materials in various lighting scenarios, and how PBR has changed the way we work and do our workflow basically. So before we start, I think we want to introduce Nora a little bit. Nora, would you like to introduce yourself a bit?
Sure. I'm Nora Shramek. Currently senior lighting lead at Undead Labs on State of Decay 3. And like I come from like a lighting and technical art background. So I've kind of done a lot of stuff dealing with like making stuff run well, look pretty, and figure out how to do that if other people don't. So yeah, I don't know.
That's funny. Saurabh, do you want to also reintroduce yourself a little bit as we do have new viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Saurabh Hamigi. I'm a technical lighting artist at Firewalk Studios. Um, yeah, I've been doing this for a few years now. I started out as a photographer, freelancing as a photographer, and then I sort of moved into tech art and naturally came here. So yeah.
Cool. And as you guys should be know, I'm Amit. I'm the host of the show, and I will be the one asking the stupid question in case you guys don't. So that should be good. So starting with PBR. So what is PBR, and how would you explain it in a simple term for someone who is new to it or struggling with it? Which one of you would like to try your explanation on that?
Not it.
All right. Oh well, I mean to expand the abbreviation, it's physically based rendering. That's what PBR stands for. But like in terms of like, I guess the layman terms is like you're trying to mimic the physics of light, when the responsive surface responsive materials in real world in basically CG or video games, right? So like I think like the most important aspects is like in real world light will basically hit a surface, and depending on the properties of the surface it gets absorbed or reflected or refracted or all of these guys, and then it basically lights up the room or lights up the surrounding environment. And also surface have like a lot of like complexity, like microfacets, different micro bumps and dents and whatnot. So basically light is a very complex phenomena, and then PBR is just trying to mimic that in whatever happens in real world in CG.
Okay. And so very often as a lighting artist you are trusting the environment team or a texture artist to do the PBR, and in your experience, have you experienced that sometimes it goes wrong or it was set up incorrectly, and if so, what is the common denominator of what is set up incorrectly?
Everything is set up incorrectly.
So you
Um,
just throw them under the bus, why don't you?
I mean, like it's because like we still don't like as an industry like a lot of times care about this and I think that comes from lack of education at the top down. A lot of I feel like higher level people don't necessarily keep track of what's happening in the industry, and their idea of PBR is magic. It's sort of like, oh, now all the engineering works and like we don't have to do anything, it will fix it all itself, rather than like in a lot of ways complexity is added. um so like I think where it goes wrong is when there isn't sort of like monitored standards and things set, when it's artist free for all. A lot of times when I run into it, it's artists having their stuff working on it somewhere, and often it's a non-standardized like sort of lighting model, and they're eyeballing things to look good in that situation. So like somehow they'll either like open some default scene or they'll add their own stuff. And then they'll like not only just like have that set up and it's like day, they only keep it at day. And it's like perfectly clear and they tweak everything to that setup. Or they start building levels and then they're tweaking things to look a certain way in that level. So it's kind of like a reverse approach, which is like the old way, right? Like there was no like conservation of energy. There was no ray traces happening to whether online or offline. Like it was just like weird thing, hacky solution to make things look a certain way. But we can't do that now, and so it breaks down when we're not following. Like artists, their job is to like sort of like work within sort of a boundary, and then down the line, lighting and tech art will make it look the way it's ultimately intended to from like production or game design needs.
So, if you were to mention top three, then you as well, sort of in your experience, because as both of you are often supporting the lighting artist, the more artistic lighting artist, and also the other team members. So, when there are problems with the materials in PBR, what would you say is the most common, like the biggest thing you keep repeating and pointing out and having to explain, and how can we explain it today so people who are watching now, when they leave this stream, they'll be like, okay, I'll be more vigilant and pay attention to this because I am guilty, kind of thing. So what would that be?
I could
Go
probably go
first
on
because
this
I
one.
just
Yeah,
talked. So.
I mean, it probably would be something
Yeah.
similar, same. It's that metals are bright. They're very, very bright. And then I think like um, people often confuse a complex metalloid or like a complex like um, what do you say? Something like painted metal to be metal, right? That's like, but it's in nature, it's not that simple. So and then they basically use something like red, that's like really dark as a base color. So if you're using something like Unreal, which is metallic workflow, that basically is telling this is a metal, but also like this is what its specular reflection value is. So I've noticed people just straight out use very, very dark values for metals most of the times, and I think a lot of times comes with the lack of knowledge of knowing how to use the material.
Okay.
That's the biggest thing.
And if I were to ask if this is metal or if it's painted on top of a metal, how would you explain this to me?
The top is metal, the bottom is paint.
It's paint.
The color
So if
part
I,
is paint. It's what
so
you're actually seeing, right? There's metal underneath the paint, but everything's like in layers. And
so if I
that's like, yeah. So
so if I
like,
scrape it, then if I scrape it and then I see this, how would
and
you
the
explain the
scraped
breakdown?
part is metal. That's why
Scraped on
we
the
like
metal.
have masking. So like, and like substance should help facilitate this, right? Because you paint in material layers. So the way you like, I try to like teach artists is like, we try to not have them making decisions about like how bright albedo is the color and if it's metal or not. We try to, I think in successful places where I've been working, like shading artists and tech artists and lighting decide how materials work, and we let artists paint with those already made materials. We don't actually let them make the materials. But let's say that's not a situation you work at a smaller studio. A way to think about it is you make individual materials. You don't build them like together. So you would make the brushed metal. You would make the paint. And then you start with the lowest layer. So you like, what is this made out of before we do anything to it? It's like, it's aluminum. So you have aluminum, you cover the whole thing in like substance designer or painter with aluminum. And then you mask out the area that's painted and you paint with the painted material. And then when you scratch it, you erode the paint to reveal the underlayer material, which is aluminum. So that way, like artists don't have to like you shouldn't be like painting different materials, like having to paint different values to like create on one like texture. You make layers and then you reveal or add on top of layers. It's like if you had dust on top of that or dirt or mud, you would have a mud material and you paint that on top of everything else. If that makes sense.
Okay.
But there's also, so like I feel like those are probably the easy ones to sort of hit, and which are the edge cases. But like whoever's worked in like sci-fi games or even games that involve guns, then you would probably move towards this area called anodized metals, which is its own rabbit hole, which is different from actually just painted metals, right? Because anodized metals go through this process where they artificially layer a coat of dielectric or non-metal on top of a metal, but as a result, what ends up happening is in the properties of like physics, it stops becoming a metal, it stops becoming a conductor. But at the same time, it has a sheen and like the specular properties of a metal. So it goes into this weird middle complex nature where it's not a metal, but it's also showing you properties of a metal. And then people are like, well, I'm trying to create anodized metal, which in well with they're absolutely right. But the thing is, if you most of the people working like let's say Unreal Engine, it's like the shaders aren't meant for these complex natures and complex like you know alloys or even anodized metals, right? And that's where if you go into that rabbit hole, oh boy, that's a whole other deal of like trying to tackle.
Okay, so let's explain some of the terms you mentioned. You mentioned a couple. Conductor. That means you also one of you probably want to explain semiconductor, dielectric, and then you mentioned something else as well. And what did you say? And
Anodized metal.
Anodized metals.
Aled as well. So let's break those down so people are actually understanding what that means. Which one of you want to try and explain
I
that?
guess I'll try to tackle it. When we start talking about like dielectric and like it's easier, I think, for like unless you're in tech art or engineering to just say is it metal or not. And that kind of tracks with Unreal. Like when I worked at Insomniac, we had a spec gloss pipeline, which is like actually a lot easier to make these kind of complex materials, but it's far more complex to actually just have average people work in because you have to deal with specular reflectance and diffuse reflectance at the same time, which everything has. But in something like Unreal where you have metallic, it does a lot of that under the hood when you say metal or not. It does some of the math. It like converts where energy goes. So like long story short, it's great to start out with metal or not metal. And if it goes outside of that, where we're in this middle range where like a material is like doing something funky because of physics and like its properties, where it goes like it has aspects of both metal and non-metal, most people shouldn't deal with that. Like that should be a tech art to do that. And I'd say like if you don't have that option, default to is it not fully metal, treat it like a non-metal. That's kind of how we have artists in most situations until it becomes a problem where like there's just something we have to display, like some alien material, or we have like this weird like rust, but it's not too rust. If it's everywhere, then we tackle that. But if it's like there's some rust on some stuff, it's like just say it's not metal, because like in the end it's about like making decisions like how much is this going to affect people like who are playing the game, and be like, whoa, that doesn't feel right. If people are like, oh, it doesn't feel like, if they're just playing the game and it's not like drastically like that's not anodized metal correctly, like most people are not going to get that. So there's kind of like always a weight of like how much resource should go into making something 100% accurate if it's like a relatively small thing. So I kind of always point to people as like the first decision you make when anything you're doing is it a metal or not? But that's kind of me. That's at least I found that to like move the pipeline forward, and also just like help people if it's not, they're like, hey, I'm working on my own stuff at home. What do I do here? if it's not like metal, if you're not sure, like, oh yeah, I know that's metal, just go non-metal, and you could like probably make it pass. But
Okay. How about you, Saurabh? Do you have the similar approach or something else you want to add to it?
No, that's totally agree on that. We've actually had the same problem with anodized metal because we use Unreal and it's primarily metallic workflow. And like Nora said, having specular glass workflow gives you more control, but it's also a double-edged sword because you're giving more control. That means artists can they have like way more wiggle room to actually create wrong compliant, non-compliant PBR materials. But I guess I can uh, uh, define or basically explain some of the terms that you're asking, like conductors. This feels like going back to physics class in seventh grade. But like materials, I mean, objects have like atoms and electrons, but basically what makes a metal is like they have loose or free electrons. Like they have a sea of free electrons, and each atom, right? So basically, energy, that's what everything is made of: electricity, heat. Um, because of that, they can be easily transferred. So electricity, conductors, basically they're good at transferring energy from one place to another. That's basically what it means, like heat or uh, electricity or whatever you want to call it, because of the free electrons. So that's basically what conductors are, and dielectrics are the opposite of that, which they don't have a lot of free electrons. That means they're not good conductors, they're insulators. So metals and non-metals are conductors, and dielectrics are going in conjunction. um, Anodized metals, like I said, they're like this breed of materials that we use in you probably see it everywhere around you, right? Like construction materials, like probably the metal that's next to you that you think is metal is probably anodized metal. It's the process is like, well, I don't exactly know how, but I believe there's an anode and a cathode involved, and it's a chemical process where it basically coats the metal with a certain um, non-metal surface. But yeah, that process is called anodizing, and depending on type of anodizing, how long it gets anodized, there's different kinds of anodized metal for different conductivity, different reflectivity and whatnot. Yeah, like I said, it's a rabbit hole.
Okay. So is it safe to say, combining what Nora said and you said, then is it metal or not metal? Then you could also ask, is it something that needs electricity? So if it does, it's safe to say it's metal, and if it doesn't, it's probably not metal, right? So that's a way of deciding as well very quickly if it's metal. I'm not saying to people to stick it in the wall to see if it's electric, but but I guess it's one way of kind of logically finding out, or at least looking online if it's metal or not, if you don't know the physics behind it,
I
right?
think going back to something Sorab said like a while ago at the very beginning, that's like really important is like conductors, or let's just start saying metal from now on, like if it's metallic or not. The light they reflect is almost 100% of the light that hits it. So the reflection is going to be extremely bright.
Okay.
If it's not extremely bright, if there's any kind of like toning it down, what you're looking at, the surface is not metal, probably.
So if it's an orange surface and I cast red light on it, is it gonna cast red light on it, or is it gonna give a specular reflection that's red on an orange surface? So how would that work?
Are we changing topic?
No,
I feel like we changed topic.
because both of you mentioned specularity, both of you mentioned reflection, both of you mentioned the
Yeah.
property of the
Okay.
surface.
I think this is a good like what you're bringing up is a good way to dig into something we're more talking about, because we actually are changing topic when you ask that. So when we say like one really important thing when we say reflective from a technical standpoint, if you see something, it's reflective. So reflective is not really the right thing. You're talking when we're talking about how much light it bounces back. It's not is it reflective or not? It's energy conservation. It's how much of the initial light that hit that surface is returned. If you see anything, it's reflective. It's how is the character of that reflection happening? And when we talk about metal and non-metal, when we say metal, a vast majority of that light energy that hits that surface is returned out of the surface. So when you say it's painted orange or something, like that already gives you the thing it's not going to be metal because you painted it. If you're talking about when you go into if you cast red on an orange surface, what are you getting back? We're talking about hue, and we're talking about energy conservation, how much of that light comes back. If you cast red on an orange surface, your red and orange are very similar wavelengths. So you're going to get an orangey red back. If you cast like a opposite color in a different wavelength, so like if you cast green light on a red surface, if you think about it, what is the color you're seeing back? If it doesn't contain something related, like red is red because it's reflecting red wavelengths, right? And so when you cast white light, white has all of the colors in it. So all of the colors hit it, it absorbs everything but red and bounces red back. If you cast green, green has virtually, like, very broadly speaking, no red in it. That energy, so it's all absorbed. So it's going to be, if you can see it, very dark. It's not going to actually, it's definitely not going to give you green. Like it's going to give you a little bit of green, which is what you're going to see, but all of the red is gone. So it's going to look dark, blacky-ish kind of thing, because that's the only bits of green that it's giving back to you.
So is gold an exception? Because one of the most colorful metal, and I believe when I was checking, it was the third brightest metal when I was looking up this. Is that is it not colored, or is it? What's the logic behind when we make gold, metal, bronze? I mean, silver is self-explanatory in this case, but I mean, gold might be something that confuses someone if they think about gold. It's still a conductor; it's still a metal, but it has a very visible color to it, right? So,
Right. So what it's doing, like in a very short, the short answer first is gold. It's reflecting gold light. And I think like thinking of materials and PBR and stuff, like it's really important to think of how things actually work. So if you see a color, that's the color that it reflects back to you. So the gold, it is metal. It's reflecting a lot of gold color back, and it's absorbing the other colors. So the
yeah.
reason you're seeing that color is because it's actually absorbing everything else. So if you shine a light onto gold that's white, it gives back almost all of that orange spectrum, yellow, orange light back to you, and a lot of the white. And then it absorbs a lot of the like blue and things like that. That's so it's all about like which wavelength, which color it absorbs and bounces back. Again, the majority of that energy is still bounced back, and you get a really bright orange, if that kind of makes sense.
So
Or do you want to add anything or correct or anything?
Yeah, I can expand on that like a little again, like going back to physics sort of thing. I think like the best explanation I've seen out there, like if it's like if someone's like, why does metal reflect so much more light back, right? Like almost 100% in some cases, like mostly. Um, it's basically like if you think about like sea of electrons floating, right? That's like free and doesn't really have like an equivalent um uh, whatever positive. So energy comes in, which is light. It basically excites these electrons, it absorbs the energy, and these electrons starts bouncing around. But energy is like energy conservation, like Nora keeps using that word, right? It's basically like you can't, energy is neither destroyed or created. The light that's incoming is equal to the light being absorbed and reflected, right? Like, so it just gets converted into another form of energy. So what happens is like these electrons vibrate. There's so much energy that's like it has to relieve it. It's just like there is like you can't hold on to it. So they basically just spit it out. So that's how, like in theory, the light that comes in, most of it gets like spit out or that's reflected back. And the way it's doing it is on the surface property, which basically is what gives us the specular lighting, right? And sort of going back to your why is gold colored. So metals react differently with different wavelengths of color, right? So for example, you'd find a lot of curves online. So if you just like look up for specular reflectivity of gold, you probably see a curve with a wavelength on the x-axis, and then um, uh, well, basically it tells you for this wavelength how much reflectivity it is. So gold tends to be that it's more reflective on red and green as opposed to blue, right? Because so those three colors RGB are primarily have two, they have three different wavelengths if you look at the wavelengths right there. So basically you see color because different wavelengths that's incident on a surface are reflected and refracted the different way. And you're right, gold is absolutely gold, but it's also still very bright. It's still like if you look at the RGB value, it's still about 240, right? So yeah,
Okay.
that
I have a diagram that I made for training at work a few years ago. If you want to see like what's happening,
Sure, if you want to share, it might help land some of the talking into something visual for people.
Oh no, where did I put it? Here we go. Okay, let's see. Share, present, share screen. Oh my god, this is way more complex than Zoom. Hang on. I think it's this one. Yeah. Okay, can we see okay? Okay,
Yep.
so what kind of happens, like this is a diagram of incoming light to outcoming light, like output light. So like we're talking about, if you think about it as like a physical, like if you could zoom in on a surface. So there's sort of layers of light absorption and reflection on a surface. So metals reflect at their very tip of their surface. Since they reflect this oncoming light, they reflect most of that oncoming light. That's the specular reflection. That's what gives us so much bright light. So you have this white light, it hits this gold yellow surface, and it almost bounces all of it back. After that happens, a little bit of that light still goes beneath that top surface and it gets slightly absorbed and then scattered and reflected back out. That's diffuse reflectance. So it's diffuse reflectance is technically a type of subsurface scattering, but it happens very shallow. So there's still a little bit, this black line, there's a little bit of light that gets reflected, and then you combine those two amounts of light to get the output color. So white light comes in, hits the gold surface. Most of that is reflected back with a character that's bright. It also gets a little bit, goes through that initial surface, does a bunch of stuff and gets reflected out. And then both of those energies get combined and outputs a remainder color, which will be slightly less than the initial light that came in because it's a metal. For non-metals, it's sort of the opposite. And this would be like a normal diffuse metal, like a rock, plastic, stuff like that. You have the incoming light. Almost all of it passes through that top layer. You get a little bit back from that specular reflectance, which is how you get like detailed reflections if something's smooth. Most of that, though, goes down into this initial like sort of diffuse subsurface layer. Very thin, remember. That gets reflected out. So the majority of the color comes from the diffuse reflectance rather than the specular. And as we get more and more complex, a subsurface like material like skin, leaves, like all these other sort of things, those have deeper penetration of light that does all of the diffuse reflectance and stuff, and then does a whole bunch of more and more complex things, and then scatters out.
Cool. Okay.
Questions about that?
No, it's good. As I also noticed in my notes, I was also looking up gemstones, and I noticed you have the same values. So I'm happy that I found the right values. That's good. So we'll do a couple of questions, so we don't go too far, but also just to double check if people understand. So if people watching, if you can leave a 1 if you understand, a 2 if you don't understand, while I go through some of the questions.
Oh, there are some good questions.
So, in your experience, are metallic maps 0 to 1, as in black and white? Because Sorob and both of you were mentioning metal is white and bright. Or do you have mid-gray values in there for special cases? I guess it's also a hidden question in terms of specular workflow versus metallic workflow as well, I suppose, in there, at least from my side. But let's answer that question and add to it. So, is there any mid-gray values in metal, or is that the roughness that comes on top of it?
I
Do you
talk
want to take
last. Do you
this?
want to go, or do you want me to go?
I'll go.
So we
Sure.
can go.
I think Nora already sort of answered this in one of the topics a while back. So like in terms of workflow, right? Let's whether you use Mixer or Substance or whatever it is, right? Or even Photoshop. I hope you're not using Photoshop to paint textures, but let's just say you are. If you're making a surface, think of it as like, so if it's like rusted rusted iron, right? So like, so you have rust and you have iron. So you start with the bottommost layer. So what was the material before it was rusted? So it was a metal. So you make the value. So like in the words of Metallica, something is either metal or not metal. There's no in between. So you basically make that as a metal base layer, and then now you're thinking about, okay, there's a formation of rust over it, right? And now you make a layer of non-metal, so 0 as the value, right? And now in whatever technique you're trying to paint on using masks or hand paint or whatever it is. So when you do that, there is going to be some grays introduced organically, because you're going to have like parts of the metal completely covered with rust, and sometimes there'll be transition areas where it goes from rust to iron. So you will introduce some values of gray, which is fine, which is unavoidable, and especially with if low textile density on the textures, you'll have way more gray values. But what you don't want to do is like create one layer with 0.65 metallic value and then paint a brown value just to mimic rust on iron or whatever metal is beneath. So that would be the right way to approach like something that's as simple as, non-metal over a metal.
Okay. Nora, do you want to add anything to it, or?
Sure. I tend to advise people to if in a metallic workflow, not paint in between for a couple of reasons. Um, yes, it's like technically true that there's some middle amount, but you really need to figure out what that middle amount is. Because how metal and non-metal works. So like if it was like when we are referring to like what is happening, there's a diffuse and a not diffuse. There are these two ranges that are on the opposite sides of like how bright that is. And then there's a dead zone. That sort of like oxidization or whatever that happens in the middle happens at a very particular point. It doesn't like go through a gradient to get to the other one. It like hits a point and then it jumps. Finding that point is like, I don't even know what, like where to get reference on that. Like I've dealt with that when I worked at like an Insomniac. Like everyone was like arguing about that in tech art and engineering, and we never had a good answer. In theory, you could probably measure it if you had a completely rusted surface, but there's still going to be like within that rusted surface, it's going to jump somewhere. All in all, what ends up happening on a rendering side of things is like twofold. One part is if you're painting that middle layer at some point where it nips, the texture starts changing, and also just screen size. it's going to like jump to metal at some point, and it's going to get super hot and bright. And if you're intentionally doing that, it's going to happen at a distance. And at some point, you're going to get a lot of that screen's real estate being that gray, and it's going to glow when it's not supposed to. It's going to get super reflective. It will happen when you have due to textile density, if you even if you just do metal and not metal, at some point because of nipping and screen resolutions, you'll get some amount of gray, but it'll reduce that due to the nature of how it isn't pre-built in. When you add values in at some point in the mipping, and due to like pixel size on screen, and then like how rendering happens and G buffers, blah, 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 you'll kind of end up with like this really wild thing happening. So I tend to just say to artists, just do metal or not metal, just for like down the road ease of use. And then what we tend to do in our shaders or in the engine is, depending on like if it's something that has mixed materials, we might even just like convert everything to non-metal at a distance. Because I've had so many issues with like things like, for instance, people have like metal railing bars and they're really thin. And then at a distance, because of how mipping happens, like everything turns metal. And the way the texture happens, you just get this wall of reflective metal. And you get these glowing, like massive, like just like squares of glowing shit at a distance. And it looks weird. So a lot of times we'll do something like force something to happen downstream. I know in terms of like we like sort of talked about, like due to textile density, when you have those gaps, there will like how it just averages pixel colors next to each other. It might make it gray, right? I know like I think Unreal might do this under the hood. I'm not sure. I know we've done this in proprietary engines where engineering would force certain things to happen due to like sort of like how many pixels are near each other. We'll just weight it one way or the other and prevent it from doing that mid-range in the output. It just forces that, is it metal or not? Because we would get like just really weird stuff would just start looking really weird once the like resolution changed. When you all of a sudden surfaces like that had a lot of rust, but also a lot of not of rust, and then also metal, just due to like the happenstance of how far away it was, where the mipping and screen resolution and stuff, it would just almost turn all of it gray. Because like the average is like it was 30, 33. And so like everything would just turn gray. So we just force it. But that's like sort of the long answer. I don't disagree with anything Sorb said. I think like there's like a lot of times due to how game development works and your type of game and all these other circumstances, you end up in situations where like you're not working in that ideal, right? You're dealing with like real-time rendering. And so like those like rules sometimes end up having to be broken. And that's why understanding those rules really solidly helps you know when to break them later. But yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was like an interesting anecdote where I often like you figure out like, oh, I have to break the rules, but I have to understand them enough to know when to break them. And metallic is always like interesting when we're dealing with distances from the camera for a whole bunch of reasons.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Vesel is asking, so does PBR not apply to stylized games, or are there few principles of PBR used in stylized games?
It totally applies to stylized games. I've kind of at times specialized for the past few years until now in stylized PBR. It actually helps make it easier, I think, because you can still work in a correct like render pipeline and then stylize the outputs. So materials still get designated as metal, non-metal, how much, or you can set where the ranges exist. You can slightly tweak them or something. Or you can kind of like, what I typically do is I change the output. I take that information in the shader and then do something else with it downstream. So artists still get to work completely in PBR, but you can set, like, for instance, stylize. If we're talking about stylized shading rather than stylized form or color, you can actually like change how the shading happens and break it up into chunks and like how much and stuff like that. So Yeah, I think intuitively, I definitely run into this where like art direction or something will go like, oh well, we shouldn't do PBR because it's stylized, or even though we're working in a PBR engine already, we're gonna ignore it. And it's like, no, no, you're gonna make my life a lot worse if you do that. Let's determine how to do it. But my short answer is you should absolutely follow PBR, especially like art content creation side, and there should be a discussion about how to achieve the result. But it's really helpful actually. So that's my take.
How about you, Sorab?
No, I totally agree with that. But also like stylized is such a huge umbrella of like sub definitions that
Yeah.
means something different to everyone, right? Um, like, are you talking about texturing? Are you talking about lighting or like um, but like my like in every project I worked on, there's been a lot of photorealism. So I haven't worked on super stylized games, but the one I'm working on is definitely less photorealistic than the previous one. Um, but like if you're gonna go down the route of breaking rules, start with the rules. Your foundation needs to start with like PBR, start with like, good foundation of following the guidelines. In breaking rules have to be intentional. So and most of and this happens in I think it will happen in every project that like, I've seen. Um I'm like, well, if it's going to be a space metal, that's fine, but your reference point for a metal is Earth. You're not going to look at something that's supposed to be metal and complain about it being dark because in your mind you're comparing that with metal you've seen in real life, right? So I'm like, you can definitely make something dark if you want to create a new element that doesn't exist on Earth, but also remember that your reference point is something that exists on Earth. So intentional breaking of rules is very, very important.
The way I try to
So,
like kind of
sorry, go
help
on.
people understand this is like anatomy. This is like a much more like easily understandable, relatable thing, right? If we talk about like sculpting a character or something, right? And you say realistic character, like it's going to adhere to how anatomy works in real life very solidly. Proportions, where things attach, the angle, potential sizes of like how big something is going to be, like some muscles, and like there's just a point where it's breaking that. When you talk about stylizing that character's form, you still need to be informed by reality, right? You don't have like, you don't say, I'm going to make a stylized human and have like the shoulder attached to the head, right? So like that's kind of like how PBR, like shading and textures and lighting works, is like when you go completely outside of like, I'm just going to grab a color and like I'm going to make black 000 RGB. Like you aren't making black. You're making a black hole. You're absorbing all light. And it's that same kind of thing with like lighting and shading and textures and material value and stuff like that. You can absolutely tweak that, but you need to understand what that tweak is doing. And when it's going to get to a point where like it's unrecognizable. Um, and there's that similar balance of like a character artist who does stylized work might tweak like proportions or um like the angle of like, like it might be more angular, it might be softer. The same thing can be said for like in the whole realm of like rendering, is like it's a modification, a modulation from reality. It's not an utter like like ignoring it outright. And so that's why it's important that we don't just like arbitrarily like grab something here and change it here and then change it here. Like you have to know what you're doing and how much you're changing it, and then the output effect that's going to have on everything. Because unlike character art, like you can make a monster character that's just disgusting and weird, or like it doesn't make any sense, and it's not going to affect the rest of your game. It's just going to be that one asset. Lighting and shading, rendering literally is all tied together, so it will affect everything.
Okay. So, um, What if there was a game that, like Paper Mario or something that's like really, really stylized to the point that you can kind of tell there's no realistic values to it? Would you recommend someone to start out realistically, or would you say just go from an artistic point of view?
Paper
Meticulous.
Mario is an interesting like thing because we're not actually probably talking about things getting rendered in the way that you render a 3D game. Um,
Just imagine this was in 3D, but using the same look.
yeah. I mean, like that's the question of like, what are your goals? Like, if you just want it, like, is it easier to make a 2D game? Like, do you want it to look like cut out paper? Um, do you really need to like render that with a directional light or point lights or spotlights? Like, do you need it to actually act like paper? Like, if you were like, I want it to look like I put paper on a table, then yes. If like most Paper Mario games, like the ones I have played, I don't know, they're not trying to be like have this meta like sort of like idea of it's actually paper in your world and the paper is doing its thing within your office. It's just like they're literally flat images and they are on top of each other. So like in that scenario, all you need maybe is shadow casting kind of a situation. So you, like PBR might actually start hindering you because it's doing all like you're gonna have to actually worry about that and camera exposures and stuff like that. That scenario seems like it'd be easier to use some other type of rendering technique, like Unity's 2D rendering stuff, and not actually have it just what is sorting and then it like can cast a shadow or something like that. Um, it depends on your goals, like defining goals and like what it really is super important. Because I've definitely seen like paper games that look like it's in a real world. Like you open the book and like paper has magically come to life and it's doing something, and that like you really have to care about. But if it's just more like abstractly paper, like the Paper Mario games I've seen, um, I don't think that's like doing PBR. I think that's just kind of like different kind of hybridized rendering.
Hmm. So basically, you can not do PBR, but then you're accepting that you're trying to just create the artistic, creative game that doesn't necessarily follow the same rules of PBR. So it's kind of like you're just drawing something and deciding yourself the values and the shadow and how things look. Basically, I can think about a couple of games like Forgive Me Father, Paper Cut Mansion, and Bendy and the Ink Machine. And I know this because I had this conversation earlier today with someone else. So those are kind of very heavily stylized games that probably don't need PBR workflow at all to kind of get the look and the ideas they're trying to push. So I guess that's what the question kind of leading to with Wesley as well is. There's pros and cons, obviously, with the PBR stuff. Like in our project, we use PBR, but at the same time, our characters are 2D. They're from cinematography. They're actual live action footage that we paint over afterwards. So they do not follow PBR, but you still need to make them look part of the 3 environment and the stylized environment we had on Estes Falls. And for that we need a specific technology to paint light on top of the image afterwards. So you have the PBR 3D, but then you have all the characters that's not PBR, and you're kind of trying to make them fit. So that's a good example from my experience, where you are following PBR, but at the same time you're not following PBR because all the characters are, well, they're not 3D and they're not going to interact in the same way necessarily. um so I guess that's a very good example from my point of view. We have another question from Paul. How do you guys feel about factoring ambient occlusion into albedo in a PBR workflow? That's a very common question. That's a very common thing I've seen as well. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Rebel is just like smiling.
This is a pre PBR uh, thing that we used to do in games. So this is even before my time. But that's physically inaccurate because AO basic. So let's say we're talking about metallic workflow, right? So if you're adding AO into your base color, right? Because metallic workflow, your base color uh, basically becomes your diffuse texture and your specular texture, or your specularity. So AO is ambient occlusion, so it's occluding. It's supposed to be occluding only indirect light, so your bounce light coming from your lights around, sunlight, sky, whatever. But if you add values, gray or black values into your uh, albedo, that means you're also technically occluding direct sunlight. So mathematically, you're already breaking PBR there. So you're basically saying instead of saying that this part of the geometry needs to have ambient occlusion, you're basically saying this part of the geometry is just black. There's a difference between those two definitions. So there's a reason why we don't put AO in albedo anymore, especially in PBR workflow.
That's why we have AO maps.
Exactly. Yep.
AO maps, cavity maps. We have solutions for that to artificially add more occlusion of light, i.e., micro shadows to surfaces. The reason we do that, the reason we have those things, is because of the resolution of cascade maps. And there's a lot of solutions for that. That by default, the question is why would you want to do that? And I don't mean that in a like pejorative, sarcastic way. I like again, it's like when you do something, you should always ask, why do I want to do that? Is there a reason I'm doing that? As an example of like, you're essentially saying I want to paint shadows in. I'll give a very specific example where, in a way, there's a kind of way this makes sense, but it's not doing AO. So let's say you have a character and you want them to have makeup. When certain styles of makeup, like you actually paint contours onto your face. Like this is not like this is like, but you need to be in that mindset of like what's really happening. So you're painting makeup contours, which means you are painting a darker color on your literal face to create a shape, because you are literally faking a shadow that will be there all the time. So if you had a light shining down here up at you, that shadowing isn't going to go away, and then it breaks the illusion. But like if we paint, like if I do makeup and it's like I'm going to like a fancy dinner with my partner or something and like did that, I'm not going to have light shining up at my face, right? So like there's situations, but it would like, why would you do that in real life? Again, it's always like start with that. Why would I do that in real life? If I was making something, would I paint shadows into it in real life? Sometimes, rarely, yes, maybe for some reason, like if you are making like a stage set or like Disneyland or something, sometimes they do like paint into like services, but sometimes that's because like you don't have like you're like painting things that aren't there, right? Like you don't have the geometry or normal maps to like have an inset for some reason. Maybe then you would, but again, these are all like fringe cases, right? Like the short answer is no, don't do that. Like you need a really good, well thought out reason. You should probably have someone like give you feedback. This is the way and time to do it. There's always an answer in like everything in life. Almost always yes or no, but there's like times where maybe. But I think like in a setting like this, the answer is like don't do that.
It's got to be intentional,
Yeah,
rules breaking, like I said, right?
yeah. Someone who really knows why you would do that needs to do that. If you're not sure, don't do it. I think is the answer to a lot of PBRs. Like if you don't know, default to the sort of rules and the like more obvious way. If it's like more like expertise, research, and feedback should probably happen.
Yeah, on the similar lines, I've definitely seen AO being plugged into the specular pin in Unreal. I've seen that a lot actually, and I
Yeah,
I sort of love and hate the specular pin Unreal gives, which is like it's like its own Unreal thing. It's not technically a metallic workflow thing. Um, but I'm like, I get why you guys did this, but also like people are exploiting this in the way it shouldn't be exploited. So like for example, when you do that, then you're just muting all the specular reflections on like parts you shouldn't be. So yeah, well, that took us a while to realize, and we were like, wait a minute, why is all the reflections is muted? So you're going to run into problems like this down the pipeline because you have 20 layers in lighting to figure out, and you miss this one layer someone's like breaking rules with, and then down the line you're like, oh, okay, that's what it was.
Yeah, definitely. The problems really start happening when you're in a studio environment or a team environment,
Yep.
and there isn't that communication. Um, when you're doing something on your own at home, and you ultimately just get a result you need because you're trying to just bullshit a good image to get a job or something. I don't advocate for that, but I understand why people do that. The consequences are going to be as big as like you actually work on a project of like 400 people, and people in like environment or characters start doing like that, and then your whole game is broken, and and ultimately everyone's like, why is this happening? And then it just gets dumped on lighting and tech art somewhere, and then it's like, okay, now I need to debug everything that these people are doing, and like everywhere I see this problem happen, I have to debug through a bunch of different potential things, starting with all the lighting stuff, all the material stuff, and it's like it takes so much time away from the actual like production of the project. Like you don't want your lighters or your tech artists to be debugging simple stuff, simple to have done right, but often that simple to done right, like to do right, is very hard to debug unless it's like really obvious because you don't think somebody's gonna do something that they shouldn't be doing like that. So
Yeah. Yeah, because when I was alone on S Task Force, I had to be more specific and correct because most of the environments had different time of day in it. So I had to make sure, obviously, that the lighting was correct when the time of day changes, which is obviously one of the advantages of PBR, which is why it was maybe first introduced, I think. Crisis, maybe. I had the first ambient occlusion, but I also turn off ambient occlusion a lot in our projects because I don't necessarily like that it has all the creases in the corner everywhere because it darkens everything a lot as well. So I'm not a big fan of ambient occlusion actually. But in terms of PBR on Aztec Falls, we had to be very, very specific because of there's the sunset and then there's daytime and then there's other color lights happening. And obviously, I don't want to change the materials or anything. But I do remember earlier in the days before PBR, yes, sort of when we used Photoshop to make all the materials and textures, we would have to do everything and be very particular and kind of eyeball everything. I remember the book as well, 3D game textures. It was the only book on the market that taught you how to do Photoshop game textures and everything. There's a big difference. But is there any difference between the definition PBR and PBL? Or is it the
I've
same
never heard
thing?
of PBL, so
No?
I don't know. What is that?
I'm
Physically
guessing
based
physically based
lighting?
lighting. That's what
Yeah.
they
I've
intend.
never heard
Okay.
that. I mean,
Is
I
there?
would think it's you know physically based rendering is like the entire thing, right? It's like everything from lighting, shading, materials, um, cameras, yada yada yada. I don't. I haven't heard physically based lighting, but I would assume that would be regarding just the lighting, like levels and like conservation of energy, inverse square fall off,
Hmm.
maybe camera exposure
Maybe
stuff,
they mean
but
they mean like physical units.
I
yeah,
think
like
it's a subgroup of PBR, right? So it's you're focusing entirely on the lighting aspect of it, but you do have to go into the rendering part anyway. So, but it's I guess it's a more less intimidating definition
it
of
actually sounds worse to me because like again, like because everything's connected, if
yeah.
you're like only worried about this one thing, how do you debug problems? And I guess that kind of like goes into even like I think somebody had this kind of question in the thread somewhere, like what is the difference between technical lighting artists and like lighting artists? There are definitely people who like regardless of title fall on like sort of a spectrum somewhere of like I think traditionally, and still a lot of the industry thinks lighting is the artsy, like very, very artsy side of it. And like you could get a concept, people in concept might do lighting, or like art directors, and it's very technical now. And so like when it's not, those things can't happen, but like everyone else is gonna, like someone else is gonna have to do all that work.
So
And so that person becomes very limited in like where they can fit. They have to just be very like, okay, you've done everything for me, and now you can just play.
yeah.
That's kind of a liability to me. I don't typically want to hire those types of lighters. It's too much work for me.
The chat is saying PBL to me is using real world values. So basically, they're saying lumens, a candela, so they're kind of correct values. Basically, is basically what they're saying. So last question before we close down. Is there a common pitfall you see regarding PBR/PBL that needs improving from an applicant standpoint? For example, junior joins and says, "Oh, I was never taught that," when you have shown them something. So is there any pitfalls you guys have seen that are from an applicant standpoint? So when you're interviewing a new staff member, or you're looking at people, even if you're looking online and seeing something, is there anything you've seen is like, no, this is a common problem, and they don't understand PBR?
I don't think I've seen enough people in the industry itself who understand PBR lighting well enough. Because like, and I don't think that's like in a negative way. And I just think like PBR is so new, and also lighting and rendering is evolving in such a rapid rate that I think the information that people are absorbing is so much like the information that's more outdated is so much faster than people like learning it, right? um so but this is for the second part where they're like, oh, I was never taught that, and I'm like, well, I can see why, because the industry itself is catching up, and I'm not surprised that education is trying to catch up with lighting. um but I think the biggest pitfalls I've seen with PBR and application is like they use the words as a buzzword more than actually knowing what's happening.
Yeah.
Because like I've had interviews where you're looking for junior artists, and then I started asking questions about them, dwelling into the fundamentals of PBR, right? I'm like,
Mhm.
well, why shouldn't this be this and that? And then you can sort of like realize that they don't really know the foundation of it. um like they're using PBR in terms of like, just like, oh, well, I'm using AO map, I'm using metallic map, I'm using roughness map. Like that's about the surface superficial info, or like info I have on it. um so I think like people really need to dig in, right? Like substance is really good documentation. Go read there. It's big, but it's like, it's very informative. Like understand the foundation. Like that should be the biggest thing. And I have a very and Amit knows this, and I do not. This is why I hate when junior artists start off with Lumen and Unreal. Like I absolutely
Yeah.
despise the fact, like, Lumen is great, but
Yeah.
like I hate it when they're like, let's just use Lumen and I want to learn Unreal. I'm like, please don't do that. You're shooting yourself in the foot,
Yeah.
because you're missing like a huge portion of your foundation and fundamentals of how lighting works, and it's going to bite you in the back when you try to apply for jobs.
I'm using
Also,
this
women
clip.
doesn't work.
I'm using this for my marketing clip for my courses because I do not teach lumens.
Yeah.
It's good. Nora, anything else you want to add to this application,
I mean, a
especially
lot
because
of
you're
echoing what Saurabh
going?
said. Like, the industry doesn't understand PBR at all. It's a buzzword. People view it as like, I know there are these inputs in a shader graph. They don't, and they're like, if I do this, I like, they know enough to get into trouble. They like know where things are, and they know like sort of a thing kind of generally happens when I do this. Which I think, part of it comes from a lot of like learning. Like we don't train people in the industry, and education is pretty bad. games are very technical. Like I just can't keep stressing that. And they're not getting actually less technical. The places that like we're already using AI at work to do like concept art and like other things. If you're not getting your technical skills, like you're not gonna have a job or you're gonna get paid very low. There just isn't a place for that in our industry, more and more and more and more. And the tools and the way things work are very, very technical. And I think especially for people who are titled artists or come out of art or whatever, there's a heavy focus on art, and I get that, but like art should just kind of be the standard. Like you should just be a good artist. And I know that's like a lot, but like it's a very demanding field. And um baseline is like you're good at art. I don't want to like hire somebody who like that's their skill set is just art. Like I just like expect that like good communication skills, teamwork, stuff. Like it's like that level of like this is so standard. Like you shouldn't like be like, oh, well, they're a good artist, but this person isn't. And that's a lot. I get that. But the industry also like when you're in the industry, there isn't kind of an understanding of that. And I think like it's actually leading to why projects are such a mess and why like budgets balloon and because the people leading the projects a lot of times are generations back in how games are made. People working on projects don't really understand the logistics of what they're doing. You know, we're all kind of like there's a lot to like it's on us to keep up, which is like not fair, but it's like where we are. um
Makes
It's
sense.
tough. It's really tough. But yeah, especially like specifically lighting, it's all the stuff Sword said. Like even I've even shading artists like coming out of school don't understand PBR, and it's like very hard sometimes. Like and I get it. I get it because it's not being taught because people don't know what it is. So I think like the big thing is like you really need to understand this stuff if you're
Yeah,
on like anybody who's like dealing if you see something in the engine and you make art, tech art, lighting, whatever, you really have to understand the basics. You don't have to get into the math necessarily. I think eventually at some point it only helps you. Again, like the more technical you are, the better your career will go. The more viable you'll be, the better you'll get paid. But
That
to
is true.
just do your job well, yeah,
yeah,
you gotta understand this stuff because if you're not getting it, it's not just going to make other people's lives have to fix it and do that stuff. It will affect you, trust me, because
yeah,
you will have to redo stuff and crunching will happen and people will have to stay late and there'll be it's a cascading effect of like why isn't this happening? How do we make this happen? I don't like the team doesn't understand this problem and trying to get to the bottom of that, even if there's someone or a few people who are really good at it, that's those people and that's it. So the more people who like understand this stuff and understand the importance of it and just have a solid grasp on the basic concepts like the like substance, like I think it's like the basics of PBR or something. If you really get that stuff and you can just repeat it in a way that makes sense to you, um, that's what I want to see.
yeah. Makes sense. I mean, for
Well,
me, I have.
can I add to that too?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. You go ahead first.
I have only two examples. One is people use the incorrect, just simple values, either too dark or too bright. Just the material is very common. I see it. I can see it very quickly at this stage when I'm looking at portfolios and things, or when someone gives me a material, if I'm doing freelancing or whatever. I'm like, no, and I hate that because that means there's more work for me. And I don't want to spend time fixing it, to be honest. So I will try and pointing out as best as I can. The second thing is not actually that technical related. It's just the ability to look at reference images and remember you're looking at an image that has light in it. So how does it actually look like if there was no light in it? What's the actual color value and albedo, that ability to analyze the image and see that and correctly manufactured. I see have a lot of people when they're given a reference images and when they send me the image, it's not correct, and I have to sit down and explain. Kind of the same things, not as technical as Sorab and Nora does, because I have to make it more simplified, and also because I don't have that deep math understanding as Sorab and Nora, but I still understand it enough to explain that. Okay, imagine if this image had no light in it, what would be the true value, the true color or the true properties of it. And I see a lot of people, especially artists, so this is very important. Even if you're not a lighting artist, this is generally important as any artist doing anything in 3D, ability to do that. So it's a combination of these two things that I see all the time. People are struggling, and I for one really dislike it, because it comes down to me again always, and I don't want to be the one who sits there and fix it. So yeah, that's like two good examples from my point of view. Yeah. Sorrow, what did you want to add?
I was gonna say, like, if like anyone who's watching this and is like the junior artist or trying to get into the industry as a junior lighter, it can be overwhelming to hear this and just be like, oh shit, where do I start, right? But like, I was talking with one of my friend recently, like, there's like this curve where you like, the more proficient you are in your field, the less confidence you get. So like when you start out, you think you know it all, right? And that's totally normal, because like when I started out a year in, I'm like, oh, this is easy. Like lighting is there. I'm like so confident, like you know what's. But then you realize, because you don't know what you don't know, like that's basically like this field, and I think that like sort of extends to every other department too. So like the more you learn, like, oh, this is complex, this is like such a, this is like, there's a reason why there's like a whole field around it, and where the technical lighting artists and lighting artists, right? And then like so I think like you need to very early on figure out how to filter out bad info and wrong information, and try to find sources that give you solid good foundations, and that's the best way to accelerate your growth, in my opinion.
Yeah. So last statement is not a question, but I think it's a good example of what people mean with PBL. It's for example, when you turn up inverse square fall off, you're breaking the principle of light, basically, to do something that you want to do that otherwise is difficult to achieve. Um, which is fine. I've done it a few times too. If an object is too close to the light and every other light that's further away looks good, I will probably turn off inverse square lock, because I don't want the hot spot on the top because it just looks ugly, for example. So that's something I would probably do as well. But there might be a better solution, and that's why you need to keep learning and be more technical, because there probably is a better solution somewhere down the road as well. I think we are ready to end the stream. I would like to thank everyone for watching, and obviously also Sorab and Nora for showing up and being part of this. If you like the stream, just leave a good comment, like, subscribe, share the video for people to watch afterwards, and let us know if you have any topics you want us to cover next time, so I can have a look at the comment afterwards and go, okay, that's a good thing we want to cover next time. So this is a good opportunity for doing that. And I'll just end the stream, and we'll wave goodbye, and I'll talk a little bit to Sorab and Nora before I send them off as well. So thank you for watching, and have a good weekend.